All right, Kirby. Just a little bit about her before she gets started. She is a Metro Detroit-based illustrator who specializes in creating art for readers. She's recognized for her cover art in adult, YA, and middle grade fiction, as well as her numerous covers for comic books. Her illustrations are known for magical themes, nostalgic mood, and feminine heroines. So she's going to be showing a lot of that work probably in the meeting today. Kirby was traditionally trained as an oil painter, but now works in mixed media techniques, including digital drawing tools. She has received her bachelor's degree in illustration from Kendall College of Art and Design, so just a little bit of background about her. And then also, outside of creating all this work, and she's a busy person, I'm so happy she's here, she's also a co-regional illustrator coordinator with SEBWI, and also teaches illustration at College for Creative Studies in downtown Detroit, Michigan. So she is very busy. And then one other thing I really want to note and also lift up is that she has some exciting news where she's illustrated a book that is coming out in the spring by Gloria Whalen, and it's called Summer of the Tree Army, a Civilian Conservation Corps story, and that's part of the Tales of Young Americans books. So I don't want to waste any more time because Kirby has a jam-packed agenda to share with you. So thank you so much, Kirby, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Melanie and Isabel and Amy, all the people who helped put this together, SVWI Michigan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super pumped, and value and lighting is such a tricky topic, and one that I am so passionate about. So I'm so excited to share some of these things that I've figured out over the years and am still experimenting with and learning. And I just want to let everybody know, feel free to take screenshots, but I would prefer if you keep them to yourself and not share them anywhere else on the internet. This will be recorded, as Melanie said, so you can take a peek again, take notes, and I hope you get a ton out of it. So this is kind of our agenda. If you've RSVP'd, you've kind of gotten a little look at what we're going to go over today. But let's dive in. It starts out pretty basic, and then we get more and more and more advanced towards the end. So if in the beginning you're feeling like, I know this stuff, just hold on. We'll keep going. And Melanie, you're going to keep admitting people because I noticed they're still coming in, right?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, cool. I'm going to put that part away then, so I don't have to look at it. So basic lighting. I think anybody who's taken any kind of, introductory art course has drawn, the dreaded sphere or apple, right? We've all done this. And I like to just kind of go over, and I often revisit this in my work because we can, even in different styles, which we will talk about, how this basic idea of a sphere translates to all different styles. And I think our entire world is made up of spheres, cylinders, and boxes. So as much as I didn't like, drawing fruit bowls in college, I do think that is a wonderful practice. So we'll begin with this basic sphere here. So we have the highlight, and the highlight is actually the specular highlight, that little one, that glint of light that you see in people's eyes. But a lot of times we call the entire light, this whole area, the light side of the sphere. Oftentimes people call that the highlight, but really that's the center light. I love the science and specificality of art, so I do enjoy the correct terms for these things. And then it leans over to, as we wrap around the object, it goes to midtone and goes then to the shadow side. Now, as we get into a little bit more complex lighting, we're going to find, and you guys can see my cursor shooting from this side, right? I hope you can see me pointing to it. Melanie, give me a nod if you can see it. Okay, good. So the lighting is coming from this direction, and then before we get to that core shadow is the terminator. And so the terminator is the edge of the core shadow. So here and technically also over here. But when this light is coming down from this direction, it hits the ground or something else and bounces back up onto the object, creating the reflected light. And when we have reflected light, it creates this core shadow along the center here. Then we have the cast shadow. A lot of people are familiar with that. but what a lot of people aren't familiar with is the occlusion shadow, which I always use my hands as an example. When we put our fingers together and we see these little cracks in our hands, there's really, really a lot of darkness in there. So whenever two objects are touching one another, it creates this really dark shadow on contact. All right, so let's talk about key light. So this is a term that's used in film a lot of the times, but it's the main light of your picture. A lot of times we have many lights, and I'm going to talk today about how to really simplify your lighting and make the lighting work for your story and the narrative that you're trying to get across. But it's the main light, the strongest light source. And then we have the fill light. So objects would be otherwise in our world completely black. We couldn't see anything void of any light if we didn't have any, light in the world. So if you're talking about fill light, this is going to be a weaker light source that is further away from our character. So the key light is what we're, that main light that's lighting our object, and then the weaker light source. But this light source can be a number of different things that I'll go over. So this is what a very common setup that photographers will use, where the key light is coming from one side and the fill light is coming from the other side. So fill light, it can be bounce light, like I showed in the sphere. So the key light's coming down, bouncing off the ground and back up onto the dark side of the figure. But can also be a flash. So a lot of times we're using flash when we're taking pictures at birthdays and holidays and fun events, because all of the shadows on our faces get filled in by that light, and it makes people look really beautiful and young and all of those things. But flash photography also, while it may look great for taking pictures of, our family or a selfie, it's not the best for form in our illustrations, because we're trying to depict something oftentimes 3D or creating a contrast that flash just won't give us. So what is a good fill light? And everyone's seeing my slides, so what is a good, sometimes there's a little lag, so I just want to make sure. Great. And when you're thinking about what makes a good fill light, or if you even need a fill light in your work, is to think simple. A good fill light is anything that's going to give you a core shadow. So a flash, not a great fill light, because it's not going to give us that core shadow. It's going to remove all shadow. Then there are two major types of lighting in your key light or fill light. So the first is diffuse lighting. We've all seen this. It's a cloudy day. It's in the shade. You'll notice a lot of times wedding photographers will shoot the bride and groom in the shade because it looks, so flattering and the shadows aren't too harsh. Other times, a reflector. I have like a big shiny round reflector in my studio that I use, and I will shoot a key light onto my reflector and back onto my subject to get a softer light. Or sometimes you can put a film over your light to create a soft feel. So this is going to create soft shadows. It's going to be medium gray to light shadows, and it can be dramatic. A lot of times people think diffused light isn't dramatic, but it can be, and I'll show you some of that a little bit later. Now, direct light, those are going to be these really harsh, think theatrical spotlights, a can light or a clamp light that you might get at Home Depot when the sun is the highest, which is different from, whatever season it is and where you live. And this is going to create harsh shadows with I showed you those cast shadows. So there's going to be those hard cast shadows. Sometimes it creates what I like to call, bottomless hole shadows, where the black, it almost looks like a cartoon hole in the ground. And of course, dramatic light is more known for being super dramatic. So an example of diffused light is Michigan illustrator Kathy Generon, and this is a great example of that soft lighting that you're seeing. So, you know, when there's the occlusion shadows where the character is touching different surfaces, we're going to see that darkness. We're going to see darkness underneath things, you know, as they turn away from the light source, and all the shading is just really dark and creates a very sweet picture that is complementing her narrative here. And then an example of direct light, artist Bill Thompson. Direct light is so challenging in my opinion, and he is just masterful at this. And I had to crack up because I was looking, I knew who would I show for direct lighting, and Bill's name came right into my head. He visited my school when I was a student, and his lecture still has stuck with me. But I had to giggle because when I looked him up, even his author photo has direct lighting in it, and that, you know, these harder shadows. This is somebody who truly does understand lighting and bold enough to photograph himself in it, which I thought was pretty awesome. Then there's rim light. So a lot of people know about rim light. You're going to see it a lot in different fantasy or any kind of those magical, beautiful scenes. And it's the accent light that's behind the subject. It's also known as the hair light, or in a lot of my classes, I refer to it as the kicker. When you're watching Netflix and things like that, you're going to notice, actually I have a bit of it right now with this window that's behind me. It'll light the hair from behind, making it look really beautiful in film. So in the beginning of my career, I was doing a lot of adult science fiction fantasy, and I pretty much had rim light in every picture I did. So you can see the rim light here on the edge, as well as this one over here, the rim light there. So when you have a rim light, a really great way to set it up is going to look something like this. So you have the key light, and then the model, and then the rim lights coming from that other side. Now, a common problem that I run into all the time with students is putting the key light and the rim light coming from the same side. And so a lot of times they'll have maybe a blue key light, and then the kicker is going to be that orangey red or something. And somehow they're trying to put the yellow or the orange with the blue, and there's no way that when light's coming from the same direction, it can separate in those kind of colors. If anybody finds something that can prove me wrong about this, I don't follow a lot of rules in art, but this is one that I can say it just doesn't work, people. So if you know an example of something that works that way, let me know. But I haven't come across it. Now, the artist who really taught me about this, kind of the king of rim light, is artist Dan DeSantos, who I studied under for some time. And so I had to show his as an example, where he has this key light coming. This is from the series Firefly. And we have a key light coming from here, and then the kickers coming from right behind, and you're seeing an orange, this orange light here. That's the rim light, that's the kicker that's showing up. And so sometimes in our work, or when we're analyzing work, mostly when we're making it, we sometimes say, hey, well, where is this light coming from? If this is the sun, you know, how is he lit from this direction? I can't do that. And what I want to kind of give you permission to do today is that your light source doesn't have to make sense. Choose lighting that makes your character look awesome, that creates simple shadows and form that works for you and your narrative. You'll also notice in Dan's work here that the key light is a cooler color, and the kicker is a warmer color. And we're always trying to keep these lighting situations as simple as possible, so that the reader can clearly understand what's going on and read the forms that you're trying to make. And by separating the temperature of the key light and the kicker, it's a great way to make your reader understand what you're looking at. So tools for lighting. So I just have a couple things from the internet that you can kind of experiment more with some of this information that I'm giving you. So there's a website called Guess That Lighting, and it's exists in a couple formats on Reddit, then on Tumblr, then it had its own WordPress site. But if you search Guess That Lighting, it's a blog devoted to taking scenes like this from different movies and diagnosing how they're creating these different shadows. And what you'll find is that the stuff that's happening in the foreground versus the background often is lit in completely different lights, even though they're in the same room. And this picture is, follows that as well. And then there is something called the planes of the head, which is a simplified form, great for children's illustration. That you can light and see the simple size breaks the complexity of faces into just a simple form where you can really see where that lighting is coming from. It's a very useful tool. A lot of times when I'm doing my work, I might photograph a model or something like that, or maybe just draw from my head, but I'll also light one of my planes of my head models that I have to also make sure that I'm following what I'm doing. And this is another interesting website called the Lighting Diagram Creator. And it can be overwhelming when you're sorting out multiple light sources, but it might be neat to kind of build what your lighting scenario is, that you can kind of keep on your drawing table, so you're making sure that you're sticking to your own rules. All right, let's move on to part 2. So this is major and minor key. Now, a lot of people are familiar with what high key and low key is, but I will review it here. So high key and low key, we have an example. This is just a bench on some grass, a high key and a low key image. And when you're choosing a high key or low key, it really defines the mood of your illustration. And certainly you can have something in between as well. But when we're trying to make our narratives really obvious, sometimes it's nice to stick to these extremes to see what we're doing. But the major key is that overall high key and low key, the overall contrast of the image. So here's a great example by Vashti Harrison, a low key image and a high key image. Just wonderful, obvious examples of this concept. And I really liked these examples because it shows that, a low key image, it doesn't mean that there aren't any bright, saturated colors in it. It doesn't mean that it has to be a dark and scary picture. It can be really beautiful and soft. And still be low key. Here's an example from some of my work of a high key image. If you think about this gradient scale, you have your white to your light gray, all the way to, your darks and then your black. The high key images are going to stay in that lighter side range of your gradient scale. So are you familiar with the histogram? So this is a wonderful tool in Photoshop that can evaluate all the values in your picture. So to get there, you go to Window and click the histogram. A lot of people just overlook this one and exit that box in Photoshop. But what it does is it calculates all the values in your picture and places them on this graph. So you have all your darks on this side, all your midtones, and all your lights. So if you're looking at this histogram without even knowing what the picture is, I can tell you that it's a low-key image because it's mounding up this way, as well as there's no white in whatever picture we're looking at. There's no white and there's very few light gray. So it's a great, sometimes if you have the intention of creating a low-key piece, you can open up your histogram and really tell where your values are located. Sometimes when an illustration isn't working out, this is where I'm headed to diagnose the problems of my images. So not all great artwork needs to be mounted up on the right or the left after these histograms. There are many, many exceptions to this rule, but it can serve, you know, just as a wonderful tool, a tool for you to use. And even when, you know, as I mentioned, you know, I do work a lot digitally right now and love the technology that's available to us. However, I do have a very traditional training. My background is very traditional. And I would and still do when I'm working traditionally, even in a sketchbook. I might take a photo and pop it into Photoshop and check out my histogram to see where my values are lying. And it's a great practice to be able to measure how you're doing. So major key, I've explained that it's the overall value and contrast of an image, but there's also something called minor key, and that's the range of values and contrast in a smaller area of your picture. So overall is the overall contrast, major key, small range is the minor key. So I've created this graph. Everyone can see this. Great. So you can see high key, mid major key, low key, and then we also have high, you know, high minor, mid minor, low minor. So say you want a high key image with a mid minor, this is what you're going to get, and I'll give you some examples in a second. So take a look at Netflix. I hope everybody has seen, you know, Stranger Things to recognize this image here. But overall, the major key here is a low key image, right? It's very dark. It's a very dramatic scene. I won't give any spoilers, but it's a lot of drama here. So doing a low key image works really well. And now let's look at the minor key. So the minor key, I wouldn't say that it's a high minor because the highlights, with the exception of the lamp, and even this lamp light isn't quite white. If you look at the background of my image, background of my slide here, that's white. Comparing it to here, there's not really white highlights in this picture. And even the faces that are illuminated by the light are not that bright as well. They're not getting that harsh lighting on it. So this image is a low key major with a mid minor. And remember, it's so important to remember that high or mid minor keys doesn't mean that there are no whites or no blacks, no darkest value or no highest value. You can have a smidge of it in there. It just can't be, you know, dominating your picture. And my graph here, I will admit, does not quite show the subtleties that exist in the major and minor keys. So we'll go back to Vashti's work here, and what a perfect example of that low key with maybe a high minor. So these bright highlights that are in this filtered, the sunlight here is a great example of that. So when you're using different combinations of the minor and major key, it creates very different moods. So when you have something like this, you're going to get intense action, you know, just like you're seeing in Stranger Things. And then down here, you know, in the minor lows, it's going to be dreamy and beautiful and ethereal and maybe magical. And then in the hierarchy over here, it's going to be happy and fun and maybe delightful. And in the darker, less contrasted images, it's going to be sadder and more dramatic. So now let's move on. Here is where, buckle up, because it's going to get really complicated. But as I will show you, these concepts can take an amateur portfolio to professional in, you know, 0 to 10. So I have a couple different ways of explaining value and how to think about value. And it's important to remember, this isn't the only way to think about value, certainly. These are two ways that I think about value. And also understand that certain illustrations don't you can't apply this method to certain kinds of illustrations, and I'll share a little bit about that too. And lastly, you can't think about all of them at the same time, or your head will literally spin off. It's far too much. So the first technique is called value organization. And so what that does is it solves this common problem. I think every artist has had this problem at somewhere in their career where their image is all gray. You know, there's no contrast. It's hard to read what's going on. We just don't know. And I want to note that these parts of these slides that I'm sharing with you right now are clips from a book called The Famous Artist Course, which are available free PDF downloads online. And I actually have some of the original books here in my studio, and they're written by a number of incredible illustrators, including Norman Rockwell. And I get really tickled by it because when you read these books, Norman Rockwell talks to you directly saying, oh, and you know, if you ever need some help, just mail me a photo, you know, a copy of your work, and I'll draw on it and help you out. But I really do believe that I mean, could you imagine? It just drives me mad. But it's a really great book, and I seriously believe that it is worth, you know, a college degree in illustration. It's an exceptional workbook for illustrators. So back to the common problem of gray, all gray. But what you can do is you can layer your values, placing dark objects over light objects or light objects over dark objects. What we have here, we have these two characters here, and they're put behind a bright white cloud, and it really makes their value pop. And you'll notice when you compare it to something like the tree back here, what's behind the tree is not as bright, and it's not as contrast, because while this tree is gorgeous, it's not the most important part of the image. And you'll also notice that there's a gradient, a half shadow that's being laid on the characters. So they're darker on the bottom and lighter on the top. And you'll notice what's behind the character back here, this cliff, is also, you know, lighter than what's happening down here. But the best part of the contrast, the highest contrast, is right here behind the character's face, and it's brilliantly designed to look just like that. So a lot of students are like, yes, I get that. Okay, layer. Do light against dark, you know, dark against light, dark against light. And what you end up with sometimes, if you're not too careful, is that nothing is really important in this image, in this example here. You know, yes, it has better contrast than the first one, but nothing's dominating. And we're not, and if nothing's dominating, that we're not telling the story. So the solution is to isolate that contrast like James Gurney did in that other image. So if I can flash back and forth, we'll see, you know, what's probably most important in this picture, you know, the fisherman's face, right? So putting that dark mountain behind him with a light color jacket, bingo, and then making that hat black against a light background is really going to help focus that attention. So I'll flip back here, kind of spotty, here, better. All right, everybody can still see this slide with the solution? Good. All right. So with this value organization, it takes that idea of layering, but what it recommends, and this concept is created by Andrew Loomis from the book Creative Illustration, one of my idols, but I've kind of presented it in a different way of how I have come to use it and think about it and teach it. But what he recommends is taking black, near white, and using only these values in the illustrations. So basically all of that gray, all of that mud in between the darks and the lights, he just says, let's just get rid of it. Let's just not use it. And we're already, it becomes hard to make it's hard not to have good contrast when you're using this combination. So with value organization, there are 4 basic setups. So what these are is I actually took Andrew Loomis's examples and I calculated the square surface area of the 4 different values, and I created these pie charts. Yes, I am a nut about this, but it was part of my research. And so this little illustration that I drew really quickly here is some cactuses and a sun and a background. Some of my students say that they don't see the cactus there, but it's a cactus. So you have 2 variations of high key and 2 variations of low key, which we already know what those mean. So let's talk about the first one, the high key. So here's an example. We all know this famous movie, The Notebook. This is a high key shot. We're seeing all of this bright white color and very little black and near black. Do you think that there is any mistake that Ryan Gosling is in a white shirt here? Maybe they wanted to have a better look at him in the ocean there, but having the white shirt is really all a part of creating this high, happy, when you're a bird, I'm a bird, and that whole feeling. Also, another high key image that comes to mind, the book turned Netflix series, All the Boys I Met or Loved Before. Those covers are also very high key, and it's just a little bit of the character's black hair that gives us that snap and pop on that cover. So now let's move on to another high key image. So Kathy's image that I showed earlier when talking about the diffuse lighting, that's another high key image with the near white dominating rather than the white dominating. Wes Anderson is known for his color in all of his films, but really, you've probably heard the term, color gets all the credit and value does all the work. And that is so true. And that is why, his films are so recognized for his color. It's because of how he's using high and low key. So moving on, everyone might recognize this from House of Cards. It's a low key example. But what's dominating here is not black, but near black, with these little touches of white and near white. And then for another example, back to that Stranger Things example, this is another low-key image where black truly dominates. Many of the 2 characters here in the foreground, they're in silhouette, essentially, with a tiny bit of light on them. So those are the four kind of different, what I call value organization, 4 different setups that you can use for that. But there's another way to do this, and there's another way to think about this. And I've kind of started to call this value arrangement. So before we had value organization, now these are value arrangements. And for the value arrangements, there are 6 basic arrangements or setups that you can use for this. So in order to talk about this, we have to understand atmospheric perspective. It'll be easy to understand because that's literally how our eye naturally sees the world. And what I mean by atmospheric perspective is that there's dark in the foreground and then it goes to light in the background. So if you guys look out your window, I'm not sure what your view is like, but as you look into the distance, you'll notice that things get lighter. It's just the natural way that the eye sees. So dark in the foreground, middle ground in the middle ground, and lights in the background. But if you always are doing that and you're always seeing things that way, it can get a little bit boring to continue to work that way. And when I learned this, when I finally latched onto this, it was an explosion of this big aha moment in my path as a creative. And I realized that you could take those 3 values, light, medium, and dark, and the foreground, middle ground, and background, and you can arrange them in any order, and it will still work. So here's an example by Phil Hale: light in the foreground, middle in the middle ground, dark in the middle ground, and medium in the background. it works. It works, and it just creates this awesome concept. So just to show you, how much I truly believe this to be just an excellent way to think about value is some examples of my own work. I'm the kind of artist who, goes back to old pieces after years and redoes them just to see how far I've come and to really solidify what I'm thinking about and the different practices that I'm practicing. So this is Kirby in 2013 with this concept, and you'll notice, it's a little bit hard to read, and there isn't a value arrangement. And then after I've learned this concept, in this older piece here from 2015, we have dark, in the foreground, light in the middle ground, and medium in the background, and it separates and it pops, and it just works. And you will notice that a lot of times artists who are trying to do a more painterly style, but don't have a good separation of their values or planes, they will often start to put lines around things. And line art totally has a place. There's a lot of styles that work great with line art, but in certain styles, a lot of times us artists, we're reaching towards line to make things pop when things aren't popping out. So I even remember myself in the studios in college, like trying to put a line around this cow. Like, come on, why can't you see it? Oh, maybe a white line. I'll put a white line around it, and doing those things. And it wasn't until much later that I understood. So I will take you through one of my biggest inspirations from when I was an art student. The pulp fiction art I was really obsessed with. This one is by artist H.J. Ward. And I saw this piece and I recognized that this followed an arrangement. So I have turned it black and white for you guys to be able to really easily see it. So we have dark in the foreground, light in the middle ground, and medium in the background, right? So it supports the narrative. So this guy, he's the scary guy, right? He's the villain. So it makes sense that he's creeping out of the shadows. And then we have the girl character who is looks like a hero. She's protecting this injured man. Maybe she's very angelic. Her hair is illuminated. She looks like she's the good girl in the story. And so the value arrangement really supports this. But I was like, what if I could try to play through the 6 different basic setups in the same image? So I did that. So I said, what if the character in the foreground was medium, the character in the middle ground, let's keep her light, and then the background becomes dark, and it still reads and it still works. Let's try it again. So what about if he's light, and what about if she's medium, and what about if the background is dark? Still works. Is the narrative as strong as how Ward tried to do it the first time? No. That he made that choice on purpose. And then what about dark in the foreground, medium in the middle ground, light in the background? It reads, it works, doesn't support the narrative as well. Medium in the foreground, dark in the middle ground, light in the background, also an option. And lastly, light in the foreground, dark in the midground, and medium in the background. You can see how this narrative is totally different than the artist's original attempt. So one of the ways that I really started to understand this and really practice it is I started taking other artists' work that I liked, and I tried to Photoshop it to play around with how they were thinking, and if I could flip the value arrangement, and if it could still be a readable, successful illustration. So I recommend, and I mean, don't post it online, but but I highly recommend take an illustration that you might find that maybe isn't so strong, and see if you can bring it into Photoshop and fix the value arrangement as practice for yourself. So over the years with my students, I do these value arrangements in paintovers for them, and it's given me a ton of practice to be able to see these basic setups right away. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, some children's illustration doesn't have a foreground, middle ground, and background. And that's so true. Sometimes you might just have a foreground and a background. Sometimes you might just have, you know, a middle ground and a background. Who knows? So the rule still applies, and you can still use the separation to help. Now, if you're doing an illustration, say a book cover that is more collage-like, and I'm not talking about collage as an art medium, I'm talking about a collage as the composition is maybe you have a head and you know, different pieces put together. That kind of work works better for the value organization. Something that is a real scene, a real place with a character, that lends itself more to the value arrangements. And you can't use both, because like I said, it's just too complicated to try to think about it all. But it's a great tool to use. Now, part 4A, how value arrangements and organization in terms of color. If you've got color, I think is the most challenging thing for myself, for anyone any student that I've worked with, and my friends, illustrators that I talk with. Color is just tough. But if you can get your values working, then color is such a breeze. So I want to show you how you can use value arrangements and organization in terms of color. And I'm just so geeked out about this because I love talking about it, and it's just so fun. So let's check out this image, Studio Ghibli. Here we have that classic atmospheric value arrangement. Foreground to background, we've got darks in the front, lights in the back. All right, check. We know this. But we also have a background that's cool colors, and a foreground that's warm. So it goes from warm to cool. But technically, there's no traditionally warm colors in this image except for the red tail lights. The whole image is cool overall. But the foreground is warmer than the background. And so we have to focus on the to be able to get it right. So hopefully everybody's seeing 2 red squares right now. Good. So in illustration, we are less concerned about the defined warm and cool colors, like how they're classically red is warm, blue is cool. That's not really helpful to us at all. But what is helpful is the comparison between those colors. So this square, it's warm. Red is warm. So this is a warm color. But this one is still warm. It's still red, but it's cooler than this one. It leans more towards purple on the color wheel if we were to look at that. And I highly recommend keeping a color wheel up on your wall by your drawing table. So if we check out those warm and cools, so the background being cooler, you'll notice, see, these blues are cool, and these ones are warmer than these ones because they lean more towards yellow. So there, it's more of the yellow greens, and these are more of the blue greens. And that's very helpful. But we also have something else here that's separating foreground to background. We have saturated colors in front and desaturated values in the back. Now, the term saturation can really goof up a lot of people, and a lot of people kind of use that word willy-nilly, but how I'm using it and what I believe the definition is saturation is the intensity of the color. So I always think about the crayon box color, the pure color that squirts out of the tube. Those are the most intense colors. And desaturated would be the neutral versions of those colors. When you're adding gray to it, you're adding black to it, you're adding the opposite color complementary to it. We'll get to that in a minute. But that when I say saturated, I just want to make sure that everybody understands what I mean by saturated. So here we have the background is desaturated and the foreground is more saturated. And that's yet another way that we can separate foreground and background. All together, when we're using, value, temperature, saturation, all together, that creates high contrast in the front, low contrast in the back. Atmospheric perspective. So you can think about temperature in the big picture, like foreground to background. You can think about that to start out. But you can also think about it on a micro scale. So let's check that out. So here we have a cool background and a warm foreground. It works. And then let's look at those smaller scale comparisons, like light and shadow. So here's an image of mine. We have this warm light and a cool shadow. It's very subtle. You have to look really carefully, but can you see the blue and purple that I'm putting in my character's shadow? It's there. And so that means that I'm not only increasing the contrast in the big picture, in the overall picture, but also increasing the contrast within every individual character or object or subject in my picture. Is your head spinning? I hope it's spinning a little bit, but it's a really helpful tool. So when you're thinking about this, you can think about what's the temperature of your light. So sorry, my handwriting's really messy. This is a scribbled out handout for my students at College for Creative Studies, but I drew out the Kelvin color temperature scale. So when you're at Home Depot and you're buying a light bulb, and you will see them using the Kelvin color scale, temperature scale as to tell you what kind of light bulb you're gonna get in this pack. And that's a great starting place, and this can be very helpful for you to look at if you're thinking about how you want, what kind of light you want, what kind of temperature you want for your light. But you can also have magical light, and that can just be anything. So if it helps to start simple and draw from life, that's great. But you can also pretty much do whatever you want as well. So let's take a look at some examples. So in this portrait here, we have cool and neutral highlights, right? These are fairly dull and desaturated, compared to the warm saturated shadows. So these shadows are much more intense, much more pure color, and they're warmer than the cool and neutral highlights. And this artist is able to do this while still maintaining that big picture temperature separation. So yes, we have cool and neutral highlights and warm and saturated shadows, but we also overall have that cool background against warm foreground. It's all about restraining, and it's hard not to use every crayon in the box and every value that's available, but and sometimes I find it's even helpful to kind of make some puddles of 3 values, or or in Photoshop you could make a little gradient scale of different darks and lights to actually choose from, so you can't accidentally make something go outside of the restraining place that you're trying to come from. So to show this example again, cool background with a warmer foreground. Would I call this foreground warm? Probably not, but it's warmer than the background. It's that comparison that's so important. So we also have a desaturated background and a saturated foreground, and that's helping push the two apart. So this is all great, and you're like, cool, Kirby, but how do we use this? And it's a great way to solve problems on the job. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Uncommoners series by Penguin Books. It was recently, well, not so recently, a couple years ago, it was rebranded, and I did the covers for the series. Now, the art director wanted an all blue color for the first, a cover that was all blue. A lot of times covers, they'll pick certain colors to dominate to dominate on. But they said, oh, but the character, by the way's jacket is also blue, and it has to be blue because that's how the author wrote it. And so we have to stick that. So, what's an illustrator to do? And it's warm and using the warm and cool solves this problem. So what I did is I did a cooler background with a warmer blue jacket. So I checked my box for my art director, but I was still able to make this character, the main character, really pop. So the background is darker, cooler, desaturated, and in the foreground, it's lighter, warmer, and saturated. And it totally solves that problem. So now, a trick question, we can go back to this, is which one's more saturated? Is it the background or the foreground? Maybe we could look at the chat, see if anybody's popping in on there. So is the girl's face more saturated or desaturated from the background? Do we got any, Melanie?
Yeah, one person saying background question mark.
So the background is desaturated. So it has more gray in it, and this foreground has more of that pure, intense color. Cool. So there's a trick. If you are working in Photoshop, there's something that you can use in the color picker to help you differentiate between cool and warm and saturated and desaturated, because it can be really tricky to really understand the differences of warm and cool. So what you can do, everyone's probably seen this color picker before, and this is how it usually looks when you pull it up. So you have your darks down here and your lights up here, and then you have your saturated color on this corner and your desaturated color on this corner. So it creates this box-like picker. But if you press this little A, it's going to look totally different. And you could eyedropper a color that say you have a similar situation. The jacket on your character is supposed to be blue, and you can eyedropper what kind of blue that is, and then it will be right down in the middle. You can go cooler or warmer, or desaturated, down here, and more saturated up here. You really got to play with it to really see how it works, but it can be a great way to check yourself if you're not feeling like comfortable of understanding what's warm and what's cool, and that situation. So give that a try. So you're probably overwhelmed if this is the first time that you're hearing this. The amount of options between value, temperature, saturation can be mind-bogglingly overwhelming. And how you can simplify this for you is to think about it in this exact order: value, temperature, big scale then little scale, saturation, big scale then little scale. And once you decide your value arrangement, then your next step, some of those choices are not options anymore. Because if you wanted your background to be saturated, but it's a color that, when it has to be light, and if it's a color, okay, sorry, let me think of a better example. So if your character has to have black hair, or your character has to have white hair, or your character has to wear a blue jacket and she has to be in the foreground, then different things, you start to narrow down what your options are. And so sometimes the story will dictate what your value arrangement has to be, and sometimes you might choose it. But if you choose your value arrangement first, then there's only so many options for temperature and saturation. So using that option. Now, there's a fourth thing that you can add that if you're following this order, this will happen naturally, but you can also think about detail and texture, big scale and little scale. And this is kind of like wizard level understanding, you know, of this thing. So I'll show you in this illustration that I was talking about earlier, the background is incredibly detailed, lots of texture, lots of paint, you know, all of this line work that I did back here. And then the foreground, the rendering is much smoother. You know, I'm a fairly painterly kind of painter, but I didn't allow much activation in my brush strokes here because I wanted it to really pop off of a more chaotic background. So you can think about simple against smooth, or you know, simple against detailed, or vice versa, because you can always flip it. So here's to show you that again: simple background, detailed foreground. So I want to take you through a step-by-step of how, when I was talking to you guys about thinking about it in a certain order, I'm going to show you step-by-step how I actually apply it and how I actually think about it, to show you how those decisions will start to be made for you. So what I often start with is I start with the local color, or some people call it the native color. It's not wrong to think of it either way, but it's just the natural the natural color of an object. The sky is blue, the grass is green. That's just what we know it to be. And so sometimes I might start with the local color. So here is just a basketball in a kid's room. And one thing that I'm paying attention to in this local color step is I try to think about complementary colors at this point. Complementary colors are natural opposites on the color scale, or on the color wheel. And when they're put right next to each other, they visually vibrate. That's why, sometimes nauseatingly so, but that's why, like, sports teams, a lot of sports teams are complementary colors. So oftentimes, if you can't remember your complementary colors, think about your sports teams, and you might be able to come up with something. So here we have the complementary colors of blue and orange, and I chose those for my local colors, hoping that it will help the contrast in the long run. So then I will start to add light with temperature. So here I'm adding, let's try a warm light. So I'm adding a warm light to right here with red and yellow. And then I'm adding a warmer blue right here where the light might also be bouncing on. And then with the shadow, see how the option is chose for me. The shadow, if I want my light to be warm, the shadow has to be cool. So when I'm adding in the shadows, the blue that I'm using is leaning more towards purple. And the shadows that exist on the orange objects, like the wood floor, I'm going to add blue to orange, and that's going to end up being more gray-green, and inherently cooler. So that's kind of how I'll lay out things in the sketch phase. And I want to show you guys how you can do this super fast. So most of the time, or I used to do this more than I do it now, but I used to go through every value arrangement with every in the sketch phase. I would go through every value arrangement, every temperature situation, every saturation situation, and try to find the best solution for my picture. Now I'm a little bit more intuitive these days, but here's how you can do it super fast. If you're using Photoshop or Procreate or Clip Studio, any of those kind of tools. So take what you did with your local color and duplicate it on 2 layers, right? And then darken the top layer, and then shift that dark top layer bluer, cooler, purpler. How would you do that? Well, Command B, color balance, right? And then you could erase out the highlights so that what's underneath, even though we didn't change the color, will naturally look warmer because our top layer is cooler. And then you can, if that's not warm enough for you, you could then brighten and warm up that bottom layer, or maybe add saturation to it to separate further. And this creates just a great base. And then you can tweak it and push and pull as you need, and add your details. Here's the kicker. this is fun to play around with digital tools, to be able to, especially a sketch phase, to figure these things out. I always have this all figured out before I go to final, but it's not just for digital artists. I started doing this method with glazes of oil and putting a glaze of blue with oil and wiping out, or putting a glaze of acrylic. And Kathy Genron, who I showed a little bit earlier, she does that traditionally, putting these color glazes over and wiping out highlights underneath. So when you're doing this, a great way to practice and to explore all options of your narrative is, can you flip it? So I just did it with warm light, cool shadows. Can I do it again with cool light, warm shadows? Can I flip it? And if you can keep flipping and practicing flipping this over and over, you will get so good at this so quick. But I think at the end of the day, you got to use the temperature that fits your narrative. Even though this picture lacks a lot of narrative, it's just a basketball in a room, but you can tell it's kind of a different story with this blue light versus this warm light. It is a bit of a different narrative, so think about that. All right, so now let's move on to exposure. And exposure is a very complex theory when practice when you're thinking about photography. Photographers talk about exposure a lot, but we as artists can also use the concept of exposure to improve our images. So first of all, what the heck is exposure? And exposure in terms of photography is talking about the aperture, how much light is let in, and then the shutter speed, how quickly that aperture opens and lets light into the camera, and then the ISO, which is the sensitivity of camera. And everybody's probably like, oh, when you think about this. Photography was my least favorite class in art school, and it wasn't my favorite thing. And so if this is like over your head, you don't have to understand cameras to use exposure in your work. And I'm going to show you now. And I know this from experience because a lot of times when I'm teaching exposure, my students start to give me looks like this, like, what's going on? You've completely lost me. So don't worry, let's think simple. Let's go back to simple. Think about your phone and you're taking pictures and something's out of focus. So you tap, right? You tap on your phone and, oh, one pops up. And then you go, oh, but I lost the person in the background. Tap. Oh, now what's in the foreground is lost. And the camera, it switches what's in focus, but two things are never in focus at the same time. Have you ever tried to take a photo of twinkly lights or a light bulb that's on? It's very difficult to have that light bulb in focus and what's in the background. It just can't work that way. And that's the same way with our eye. So by thinking about the narrative of your picture, then you can decide what you want to expose for. So here are a couple different examples. But so here's an example of some dude with a lot of light behind him, and then he's in full focus. All right. Now, what if we wanted to see the clouds in the background? It was more about the sky. Then the character would probably fall to silhouette or almost silhouette in order to be able to see the sky and the clouds, or maybe you're taking a picture of a rainbow or something really detailed. But when you expose and see them both in focus, it looks weird. Our eye doesn't see that way. It just looks wrong. And a lot of times in portfolios, it ends up looking really, it has an amateur look to it. And nobody can ever really put their finger why. They're like, I don't know why this doesn't look pro, but something about it just doesn't work. And it's usually because of this, because of the focus of too many things at once. So here's an example. This painting is exposed for shadows. You can expose for two things. You can expose for your highlights, or you can expose for your shadows. And this one's exposed to shadows. So you'll notice how the highlights on the back of this character's shirt is blown out, right? It lacks detail. It's also beautiful. The sun is radiating, off of her back that way. And it's, we can't see what's in there. but all of the detail of these amazing fabrics and clothing is in clear view. And that's because the narrative of this picture isn't really about their backs or about the background. It's about, you know, these rich textures, clothing and color. And so if we were to want to see the detail in the back of this shirt right here, then probably all of this, it's a very sunny day, it's direct lighting, hello. All of this would have very black shadows falling across all of these figures here. And so we can only have one. So here's another example, another direct lighting. And this painting is exposed for the light side of the object. So here on where the sun is hitting, we can see all of the details in the clothing, you know, all of the little details that are the light is shining on. But what we can't see is we can't see what's going on in the shadows. In the shadows, it's falling to silhouette. This character's face, we don't even know what his face looks like because it's falling into shadow, which could be a great tool in a narrative. So be a wizard and use what you know to break the rules and make it work for you. So here's, you know, James Gurney again, the myth, the legend. Highly recommend his book Color and Light. He's using direct lighting, which is very challenging to use in my opinion, but he's also using high key. He's using fill light to light these shadows. You know, if you think about yourself on a beach like this, these shadows would be black bottomless holes if the sun was this intense. But he uses fill light and exposes for the shadows. And now these shadows are light and happy and beautiful, and we get to see all the texture of the dinosaur in the shadows. So when you're thinking about exposure, you're thinking about the value. This is kind of where it appears in that process, is thinking about your value arrangements. You start thinking about your exposure, and then at the end, the detail, you start thinking about the exposure. And just like temperature and saturation, you want to play with that. You want to, well, what if I expose for the light? What if I expose for the shadows? And figure out what supports your narrative the best. So think, what's important to your picture? And that's what you should expose for. So if you are stylizing your work, as a children's book has such a wonderful variety of different styles that end up on our shelves, exposure can often hint at, you know, if you're searching for a style or you're searching for your voice, thinking about exposure can help you know where to flatten, where to compress information, or simply just let go and let it not be important part of the picture. So here's a style that's been creeping up in editorial illustration, and it's by Edward Kinsella. And you'll notice how his style, he's exposing for the light, so all of the highlights of this character, we can see the detail, but in the shadows is just black. And by using this, he has created a style. Now, I don't know him. I don't know if it's something that he was thinking about. You know, for a lot of artists, I think these things come naturally without really knowing the terms for it. But if you're struggling to find a style, thinking about exposure can help you know where you want your detail and where you might play with some flattening or something like that. Now, one of my, when these came out by Gani Montez, I just lost it. The Pink Power Ranger, the best, in my opinion. This one, and this is a whole series of all for Boom Comics, if I'm remembering correctly. This character would have been in full shadow had it been exposed for highlights. But because it's exposed for shadows, we're seeing all of the detail that's happening in the shadow. And all of the highlights are blown to bits, and it really creates this powerful, magical, feeling when that highlight is really glowy and fun. So here's a example, a sketch that I did, and it's not as intense of of an exposure, but you'll see how the light that is on the edge of the character is blown out. It lacks detail, and if this were in real life, this character would probably be in some pretty direct there are a lot of heavy cast shadows that would be happening here. So it's exposed for shadow. So to me, the narrative in this piece was all about, her cute suit and how the style of what she's wearing tells us about who she is. And so that was a really important part, especially since you can't see her face. So if I had a bunch of shadows, heavy shadows on it, it wouldn't come through how I intend it to. And another example of my work is also exposed for shadows. This might be a trope of mine, a tool that I use oftentimes. So if the background is soft and lacks that focus and contrast, and then the characters who are in shadow, we can still see exactly what they're wearing and what each girl looks like and the details. And because it's important to my narrative, because I'm talking about this idea, this wistful, these girls and their dreams, and seeing this airplane and this repetitive element of the paper airplanes. And if you notice close, there's even airplanes on her shirt. And that's an important part of the narrative that would have been totally lost had I focused on the highlights. But I allowed those to be blown out. So here's a couple more examples. The Powerpuff Girls series, I think, has just phenomenal backgrounds and really shows this idea in play. So here, their bedroom exposed for shadows. Look at how where the highlights are on their bed is, you can't really see what's going on there. It's bright. But then we know everything that's happening in their room, all in the shadows, because it's exposed for shadows. And here's another example, also exposed for shadows. The light is blown out and lacks detail, which just creates this wonderful mood. And then everything else has the detail that's in the shadows. And this one, exposed for lights, what's in the light areas we can see clearly, and what's in the shadows is less important to the picture. So this is another example of my work from my book that will be out next year, but it's exposed for shadows. So the characters here are under a covered porch, right, where the shadows are, but it's this bright, happy day and this happy moment. So the sky is blown out, the highlights are blown out, but the characters don't have that heavy shadow on them. And also, it creates a wonderful spot for type to lay, in illustration, which is so important in picture books, is having that type be, one of the characters that we're exposing for. So this concept is used all the time and is so effective. So I want to show you guys some more stylized examples. So my friend Deb Paluti, fellow co-illustrator coordinator in Michigan, is also using this concept of that white blown out background, and all of her characters we see in full detail. If you could even imagine this image where the background showed, a bunch of stuff, or wherever these characters are, we wouldn't really get to enjoy every little detail of these characters. And it really creates this high key, moody image by using this that way, and not having those harsh shadows distract from the story. Another example by Lucy Ruth Cummings. So cool how this out this window is that bright white light, like what you're seeing behind me right now too. You can see all of this, and it's no mistake that this is framing this special moment with Truman. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. But it's also exposed for shadows, being indoor there. So another example of me doing this on a white background, kicking up those highlights on the edge to create this blown out exposed for shadows image. right, I'm just looking. Oh, we're doing good. So part 6, lighting patterns. So this is going to really change how you watch TV. Sorry if I ruin it for you, but it's really awesome to recognize how lighting in film has influenced our brains as readers, or as consumers of visuals. So, for example, when you see there are these special patterns that are repeated in day-to-day life, and especially in film, that our brains say, that's a human. That I can recognize that. And they continue to use these lightings to create fast reads. So for example, when you're watching TV, the camera constantly cuts, new angle, cuts, new angle, cuts, new angle. And so to be able to soak that up quickly, the readability has to be real, the contrast has to be really excellent. And so there's a couple terms that we can use to talk about this, and how it can translate to your unique voice and style is broad and short lighting. And so short lighting is when the dark, so if we're looking at a character at 3/4 view, which means like something like this, it's when the dark side, the shadow side of the face, is closest to the viewer. And broad lighting is when the light side of the face is closer to the viewer. So that's just a term we can use to talk about it, but we'll go a little bit further. So first up is my absolute favorite. It's called butterfly lighting, and AKA called Paramount lighting, because Paramount Studios created this lighting. And what it is, I hope you guys can see me, but it's the light is a little bit above the forehead, directly in the center. And it's shooting, right down from above on the face, and it creates this just adorable little butterfly under the nose. The shadow here, it creates that, and that's how it was dubbed butterfly lighting, or Paramount lighting, as some people call it. And this look is used very often, and is very flattering. You'll see it a lot in old Hollywood films. Just search old Hollywood, and every woman you see will be lit in butterfly. And so this one especially, you can really start to see that butterfly shape right there. So it creates a high cheekbone, a butterfly under the nose, shadow under the neck, and a little at the brow as well. Now, loop lighting is taking that same exact placement of the light and moving it over just a little bit. And so that butterfly then goes the opposite way and shifts over and creates a loop, a little, so it's called loop lighting, a common, a smart lighting solution that people see over and over. It's not uncommon. Not these days, but at a restaurant with my husband, and I'm like, oh God, loop lighting, right on his face, right there. Or, you'll start to see it all the time, because the way that our features are placed, they create the same shadows on every person around. And then there's something called Rembrandt lighting, called it because of Rembrandt himself. And it's when you take that loop lighting, and so from butterfly, you've moved it over, and then Rembrandt, you moved it way over. And so it's really gone all the way over. And the loop that you saw has now then connected with the shadow side of the face, and creating a cheeky little triangle of light peeking out over on the dark side of the face. And so this is a very powerful and dramatic look. I don't think I would recommend lighting children with this, but maybe a villain might be, or someone really strong. And so you can see these actors, and it's a very edgy, confident look. And of course, in pretty much all of Rembrandt's work, he has that cheeky triangle, his signature, on the dark side. Now, let me point out something really cool to you right now. So we talked about, the value arrangements and the layering, and you will notice that Rembrandt, on the light side of his face, the background will be dark. And on the dark side of the face, the background will be lighter. And so it's the same wall, but he just changes the value so the face pops off of it. And these ones aren't the best examples of that, but next time you view a Rembrandt piece, check that out, how on the light side of the face, the background's dark, on the dark side of the face, the background's light, and it just pops that face right off the wall. All right, then we have split lighting. This is the one I personally use this one the least, but it's that light is placed directly to the right or left side of the face, illuminating one side. So what happens if you have a split light and then you add that reflector? Remember from the part of this lecture, we talked about that bounce light, that fill light. So without a fill light, it looks like this, right? This just all into shadow. But sometimes we might need more information because maybe that's important to our story where we need to show more of that face. Or maybe there's some kind of, it's another color, it's a red light, and it's part of the narrative that this character is going towards something. And so when we add that reflected light, so going split lighting, coming over here, bouncing back, then we're going to get a light on the other side of the face as well. But an important tip is that the dark side of the face, even if you have a reflected light or a fill light, whatever you want to call it, it's never as powerful as the light side. And if this light gets too powerful and too bright, then you flatten your face. And you're losing all of that 3D aspect that the core shadow really supports. So style is simply how we simplify things, and this idea of the sphere is how thinking about that and how you compress those shadows or light is style, essentially. So here, this is an example of a picture that I took at Dan DeSantos's workshop, a portrait workshop that I took several years ago. And you can start combining what you know with other to create different lighting setups. So here we have, a butterfly light on this character, and then for the key light is a butterfly, and then the kicker is a warmer light that's coming from this side. So you can make those together. Now, I have to point out these little toys. I have a whole box of these toys. They're called a couple different names for them. They're called Hot Toys or Kumik, and you can find them on eBay. They're this big. They're really small. They also have hands and full figures, but I find the faces are most useful. They can range from $20 to $40. Don't pay more than that for them. But they're so detailed, they even have pores. And if you light them and photograph them in certain settings, they are an excellent resource, especially if if you need to paint someone that you might not have access to a certain kind of look that you're going for. Maybe you don't know somebody personally, but you could find, a Kumik or a Hot Toy that fits them. In some of the work that I was doing with Marvel and video games and things like that, I was having to do likenesses of certain celebrities that I would draw. And I couldn't certainly invite them over to my house, but I could buy their miniature head online. And that's a great tool. A little creepy around keeping it around the studio, but they've been a great learning tool and something to refer to when I need. So this concept is not just for realism. And a lot of times when I'm talking about these things, people can be closed-minded into thinking like, yeah, but I don't want to paint and I don't want to be realistic. But understanding these things and how to simplify them only creates a stronger style. So using those main shapes and portrait lighting to create that fast read. And if you're using those shadow shapes from the portrait lighting, people are going to say, yep, that's a person, that's a kid, they'll know what it is. So a great example is Molly Idol. Look at this. Hello butterfly lighting here. That little drop under the nose, is just a total signature of butterfly lighting. And it helps our mind understand these stylized faces that are just phenomenal. You might recognize, I don't know if you're familiar with this series, but you'll notice it a lot in different cartoons. So look at this. This is a kicker. Now, if you were to use a kicker as a key light, like they're using right here, their front of their faces would be all black, right? So it has a fill light coming, probably from this angle here. And so that's why these shadows aren't bottomless holes. So a kicker as a key with a fill to show the face makes perfect sense. And even the shape of the kicker that you're seeing, that's another portrait lighting scenario that can help us with recognizing different characters as humans. So here's an example of loop lighting. And notice here, and especially since we're here with SVWI today, talking about children, learning about what shadows age people. And so some of the shadows that I've learned to create different ages of people is the brim of the nose. So you'll notice how the shadows on these younger characters, this is loop lighting, but they don't have a connection right there. They just left it out. And figuring out how you can leave certain shadows or highlights out can really help control the age of your character. So the brim of the nose, is a good one example. Also, anything to do with like the smile lines right here, those shadows. So many times, we're trying to get getting that age right is such a tricky thing in illustration, and just learning about what shadows are aging our characters, simply eliminating them gives us a lot of control over that. So those are a couple examples. And then Scooby-Doo, especially, I love the original Scooby-Doo images. They are, Rembrandt, split lighting, loop lighting. They also, in a lot of the spookier scenes, they're using that colored rim light as that accent light in the scene. And it's another great example of stylizing those shadow shapes. Look, Daphne, she doesn't have that shadow. None of them have that the traditional loop lighting or shadow on the side of the brims of their nose. So look at these as examples of that as well. So Rebecca Green, can you see the shadow shapes here? We have, under the shelf, that brow shelf, we have the shadow, and then under the nose. And I didn't ask her, but I would think that this is totally inspired by observing loop and butterfly lighting as a way to make up lighting in more imaginative and less realistic drawings. So Into the Spider-Verse, if you guys saw that movie, here's an example with a loop light with a ton of fill to create it to be a much lighter, shadow. And another example, a split with a fill light, and then Rembrandt lighting with a fill. So notice the fill here, you can see that beautiful purple and blue on this side of the face. And that fill is clearly, maybe it makes me think that this character is sitting next to a blue wall, maybe definitely behind him is blue. And that key light is coming in, boop, 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 hitting here, and then bouncing back, putting that blue on his face. So I've showed you just such a range of styles here that are using those portrait lightings as a way to simplify. So now to wrap up, and we can take some questions, I'm going to go through one last thing, and that is a step-by-step of thinking about all of these things in one of my paintings that I did this spring for a cover for Uncanny Magazine. It's that unicorn piece. So this is my initial sketch. I strongly believe in sketching. The sketches to me are more work. That is where, doing the final painting is kind of like painting by number in my book. All of the creative, all the thinking happens in that sketch phase. And I usually give my clients several variations of a concept, but this is the one that they chose. And all my value arrangement has been all thought out. Then I'm starting to draw actually, the line, the structure of the piece. I'm thinking about the perspective. And I also often sometimes think about just the flow of the piece and how I want the eye to move through the piece. So a lot of times that is an S shape, and I'll be putting that on there as well. So now you can see right here, I talked about using that local color of, the grass is green, the sky is blue. These are just local colors. Their clothes are the local colors. And my value arrangement at this stage is locked and loaded. Like, it is all there. Big picture value arrangement is there. And then as I continue to paint and I continue to tweak, you'll start to see in these ones that the saturation, I'm starting to push and pull the big picture saturation. So up front is getting more saturated, back here is getting more desaturated and going further back in the distance. And as I do this, I'm constantly checking that histogram, turning it black and white, and making sure that as I move on to the next stage of temperature and saturation and all of that, that I haven't lost my value arrangement, because that's where trouble comes in. If my value arrangement is it, I can't screw it up. So I'm always making sure that the value arrangements are right. And then I'm maybe thinking about the temperature in the big scale. You'll notice the background's getting cooler, the foreground's getting warmer, push and pull, and then also the detail, the exposure. You'll see here that I've flipped my painting horizontally, and that is something that I'm always like, oh, I don't want to do this, because I know it's going to be like super cringy, but it's so important to keep our eye fresh and flip our paintings horizontally, even if you're working traditionally. A couple other tricks I learned in an atelier oil painting workshop, that you can take a little mirror, like a mirror, or actually if your cell phone has a black screen, like black, you can put your face on and look at as a mirror and see the reflection of your picture into the mirror. So I would be looking at it like this, and I can actually see in there. And that's a great way. I always have that mirror close by to look at it reverse. Sometimes printing out a picture, even if I just have a crappy printer, and just printing it out, I'm like, whoo, I gotta fix that. Or simply moving it to another room is a great way. Text it to yourself. One thing that I used to do when I was first starting it out is I would put it, when I think I was done with a picture, I would put it in an email and then write like an art director I really wanted to work for. I would like address it to them, and I'm like, oh God, no, don't send that. And it would help me like keep my eye fresh. So back to the step-by-step. So I'm doing those things. I'm keeping my eye fresh, and you'll notice that the moon planet in this illustration is starting to tap down because of that detail, and the horizon line is slowly going to disappear. And you'll see in the next slide that the horizon line is practically obliterated because it's in the background. It's not important. I want the detail against simple going on here. So the big scale is in place, and I'm looking at the temperature, saturation, detail, texture in a small scale as well. So now it's more about fixing these characters and the foreground detail as well. That's what I'm focusing on there. So that is what I have for you guys today. You can check out more of my work, updates about what I'm up to on my website. And I also just want to share, a way to support me is to pre-order my book from maybe your local bookstore, or request it from your librarian are all great things to see that. And then I also wanted to let you guys know that I have a mentorship program that I do. Art school prices continue to rise, and I'm really passionate about teaching in a way that is kind of goes back to that apprenticeship on, mentorship program. So I have a program where it's a monthly video call and weekly email updates. And then I also have an a la carte, type mentorship where, you can do a portfolio review or a paint over to, troubleshoot or diagnose and get that feedback that you need. For this lecture, for everybody who came in, if you share my work or tell me what you think about about watching this presentation, tag me, share it with the world, and I'm going to enter everybody who does that in for one free portfolio review with me. So I'll announce that on Friday, probably via my Instagram. So now I think we can kind of open up, and I'll stop sharing my screen and we can maybe open up for some questions.
Yay, I didn't see any in the chat yet, but do you want to maybe
Yeah,
come in?
Yeah.
So much information.
It's a lot.
A lot of thank yous and wonderful, and it's so jam-packed. Yeah.
Here, let me try. I pull up the chat here.
Yeah. A lot of thank yous. Oh my goodness.
Oh, yay. Hey, Deb. Hey, Nick. Gabrielle, hello. Lots of familiar faces.
Feel free to type in the chat if you have a question.
Yep, and doesn't necessarily have to be, about the lecture. It could be anything to do with illustration, children's books.
Here's one from Kara. I don't know if you can see it. I can read it if you need me to.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, it keeps moving. Curious, when you flip your work horizontally, what is it you're looking for or find that helps you fix?
So what I'm looking for is that glaring mistake, that thing that's getting lost because of lack of contrast, or it could be something goofy in the composition, like a tangent or an anatomy issue, anything like that. That's something that's maybe popping out too much that isn't part of the main part of the story. Those are the things that I'm looking for. It's very interesting. I read a lot about how the brain, oftentimes we can fill in information because it's our idea in our head. And so sometimes our brain, if we keep looking at something and we want it a certain way, our brain can actually fool us into thinking that it looks better than it really does. And there's this constant race when we're growing as illustrators, which we are our entire life. It's this lifelong trade that our eye gets sharper, and then our hands get sharper, and then our hands get sharper, but our eyes lagging behind. And it's this constant race of, keeping up, pulling back.
Perfect. A lot of people are asking about the references and materials that you have brought up. There's a number of books, websites, and things that you're using as resources. I didn't capture all of them. What is the best way to get that to everybody?
Yeah, so which ones? So the Kumik and Hot Toys is definitely, one that I've recommended. I think someone's talking about the dinosaur. That's James Gurney. His book Color and Light is one of the best resources. If I can only take a couple books on a desert island, it would be that book. In terms of art instruction. So he's wonderful, and also his blog. He's the author and illustrator of Dinotopia series, if you're familiar with that. But his website is just a wealth of knowledge of all sorts of really scientific ways of thinking about color and light and everything illustration. So highly recommend that. Yep, a lot of people are Dinotopia fans. How can you not be? It's really great.
Great. Here's one. This is when reviewing a page for comic or graphic novel design, would you recommend considering the panels as one whole when reviewing the value of lighting detail on the page? That was from Des.
Yeah, so that's a great great question. And it's such a complex compositional problem, a fun compositional problem to solve. So it's that idea of that big picture, small picture, right? So you have, the overall composition includes the designs of the panels. And then within each one of those panels has to also have a solid design. So you can almost think about it separately, but it's very much like picture book illustration, where you're wanting your composition to lead the eye to have a flow through your picture of all of your panels. So a lot of times in picture books, we're saying, point the character to where they're going to turn the page. Same thing with a book cover, right? All the action is always, and this of course varies in different parts of the world where, people read from different directions. But in the United States, a lot of times that action is pointing towards the right where the page opens. And then with panels, some comic books have a different flow. And of course, depending on the book was published, it has a different flow, but you want to allow the flow to move through from panel to panel, as well as, I don't think it's uncommon for panels to have one of those panels on every page be the star of the show and have that little better extra contrast in that.
I've got a question here from Renee. She said, thank you for doing this. What would you say was the most useful tool when learning to separate warm and cool colors within the same hue? And a second question to that is, any exercises you did that really pushed you to reach an aha moment in your colors?
Yeah, so that whole idea of the ER, warmer and cooler. So a game that I play with myself like all the time, and especially when driving, I'm looking at the pavement, which where I live is usually, a black top. And I always ask, is the pavement darker or lighter than the grass? Darker or lighter than the sky? As clouds move in, storms move in, different things. Is that cloud lighter or darker than the sky? Is the sky lighter or darker than that cloud? And making those constant comparisons in your life with value, because it's value that's the first step, then color. And then as for when it comes to that warmer or cooler, I think my experience with color mixing, and a lot of people will comment who learn from me. When I'm using Photoshop, I talk about it like I'm a painter, like a traditional painter. So I'm calling it cyan is cerulean, and you really have to have that experience of mixing that color. I would recommend, taking every complementary color and doing that scale from red to green, and notice how in the middle it's gray, and how those subtleties go about. I would recommend in art school, we had to do pages and pages of little swatches of, reds that move to cool. And also being aware of that sometimes certain colors have these different tendencies. Like, for example, when it comes to the complementary colors, yellow and purple are incredibly difficult to work with. And that's because orange and blue, if you were to look at them in black and white, are similar value, right? They're both kind of in the mid-gray area. Same thing with red and green, in that middle gray area. Yellow and purple, on the opposite, purple is dark, yellow is light. A tiny bit of yellow and purple does practically nothing. A tiny bit of purple and yellow is like, overpowering. So understanding those relationships and mixing cool, each color in cool and warm, and making a reference sheet for yourself to be able to see it and compare it, I think is a really great practice to do.
Here's a question from Gabrielle. Do you have any tips on lighting dog illustrations? I find wavy fur, for example, she said a golden doodle's fur, lots of fur. Very hard to show highlights and shadows without taking extremely long piece by piece updates.
Totally. So I believe, if this is the Gabrielle I'm thinking of, has an adorable golden doodle that I've seen on Facebook from time to time. So first of all, finding reference for dogs in the first place is just so tough. And so a couple tips that I have for that before we get into fur is take a walk down Michael's or Hobby Lobby or any place like that. And they often have this aisle that has all of these miniature animals. And I buy a lot of those as you know, to get those different those are great things to light. Sculpting them is a great place to light as well, and to be aware of their values. Now when it comes to fur, if you draw, or hair, this applies to hair as well, if you draw every hair, it, you know, the whole idea of exposure, it's going to end up looking odd. And I've always thought of hair or fur, I always say it's smoke with highlights on them. You know, so think of those vague shapes of smoke and then adding highlights. And remembering, you know, when I draw dogs, I'm not doing the fur over the entire dog. You know, I'm only accentuating those little bits. And here's an interesting tip. So there's a really old piece of mine, and maybe I can even pull it up, but it's this boy who's coming through all of these feathers. And there's literally like 500 feathers that I drew on this. And it looks very detailed. And people are like, oh my God, Kirby, you're crazy for doing all of those. And I'm like, but really, if you zoom into that, you'll notice that I only actually painted highly realistically like 3 feathers, and your brain sees those and fills in and knows that the rest of them are feathers, even though some of them are just blah, blah strokes and stuff. And so when you're drawing fur or hair, you really only need to show a few little areas, probably around the face or wherever is important, to make us believe that the entire dog is fur covered. So overdoing it's very easy to look at fur and feel daunted and get distracted into all of the shadows, but looking at those basic shadows. There's also a tool in Photoshop called, let me just pull it up. Or maybe I can. We'll see it. It might lag here. Got a lot going on. But there's a tool that you can look at it if you edit your photo, your reference, to a high contrast and then turn it black and white, you're going to see those major shadow shapes and the major highlight shapes. And if you use that, those are really all the shapes you need. And a lot of times people get lost in the micro lights and highlights rather than the big picture lights and highlights. And that's so important to keep those things in mind.
I have one question on here from, one question I can't answer is, yes, there's going to be a replay of this. So this will be available on the SCBWI event page for Michigan. One question from Ruth, which I don't think we're going to have a lot of time, but I wanted to highlight it. Maybe just going back and re-listening would help, is can you talk through your final version of the final book image you showed, yours, and talk through the choices and value using the 2 value systems you talked about?
Yeah, so which illustration?
Let me see where Ruth is. Ruth, do you recall which illustration that is? I've unmuted you.
The last one with the beautiful planets.
Oh, okay, the unicorn, yeah.
Yeah, unicorn rainbow.
Cool.
All right, so hopefully you can see. Okay, so tell me, Ruth. So you're interested in the temperature, the choices. That's where you're looking at most.
No, I wanted. Well, yes, but you should talk to. This has been fantastic.
I'm so glad.
A lot of info. I mean, really, I'm so excited. But you talked through 2 different ways of looking at value. Value struck. I can't remember their names right now.
Yeah, value arrangement, value organization. And okay, yeah, I got you.
I was interested in having you just gloss super quick
why I chose one or the
And
other.
then do temperature also.
Yeah, totally. So this one, I chose a value arrangement prior to organization because it's not collagey. And just me as an artist, I tend to lean more towards the arrangement because a lot of my work is kind of based in an actual scene. So we have dark, and then we have medium in the middle and light on the background. This is just that classic atmospheric perspective. And then as for the temperature, this is warmer or I'm sorry, I've been talking a lot. This is cooler. So this green leads a little bit more towards blue. And then you'll see this yellow back here leans a little bit more towards yellow. It's more of that yellow green. This is more of that blue green, especially in these grasses or in these like the flowers right here in these cosmos. That's a much more blue green, while this is a more yellow green. And so you can practice that by even just mixing, blue with some yellow to make green, and then mix more yellow, and you're going to end up with more of that lemon yellow look. And then if you took that same green and add more blue to it, you're going to end up with more of this kind of look here. You'll also notice that I back here is much more desaturated and up here is more saturated. Mm-hmm. So does that cover you?
Yeah. Am I still unmuted?
Yeah.
I love the way you threw in the pinks.
Oh, thank you.
It's really hard when you get into trying to apply these structures to all the little elements, because then you've done some things to really accentuate the first choices you make, but also activate the whole and like make this circle of these flowers, right?
Right.
That imitate some of the circles. So like, and then final sort of comment / question, then it looks to me like you treated the figures. You didn't do a lot of modeling on the flowers because it didn't matter. But on the figures, you really wanted to do some modeling to give them some richness and
right. And that's my voice and my style coming through. You'll notice with the pop of pink, I didn't go for a pink that's, more red. I went for more of a magenta pink, which leans, more towards blue, which supports that, cooler in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, so it's really beautiful the way the figures are against the paler blues and paler yellow greens. I just love that part of it. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome.
Great job, really fast of doing that. Thank you.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. All right, I think maybe we have time for one more.
We have one more question too. So, and it's from Michelle.
Oh, hey.
And it's more on collaboration and what those look like. So do agents and editors allow these conversations to take place when you're talking about text and you're talking about the narrative and how light impacts that? How are you determining that, or what kind of conversations happen around that?
Yeah, it's a lot of times, my background was more in book covers, and in that realm, I didn't speak to the author at all. And though typically that was really a very intentional part of our industry, because I'm an expert at image making. The author is expert at their story. The art director is an expert at leading this entire team through this visual process, and the marketing part of the publisher, everybody has their own expertise. And, when all heads are together, sometimes we have to do what's best for the book, and each individual group understands what's best for the book. And so it's a unusual relationship. It's something that people are like, really, there's no collaboration, but usually there's not. Now, with my experience with my most recent book with Gloria, I did not collaborate with her, but I did have a lot of different questions because we were dealing with some historical content and researching. And so I did reach out through my art director and editor to talk, about some of that research and get, Gloria's vision on it as well, so that, we could make that decision together. So yeah, in my experience, there is not a lot of collaboration between the people. And though that seems odd, I do believe that what comes out is what's best for our baby, which is what's best for our book. So I hope that answers your question.
Cool. We don't have any other questions, and we're about to hit 3 o'clock.
Perfect.
Kirbi, thank you so much for taking time out and walking through all this information, which I think is so wonderful. Everyone is commenting and saying how wonderful it is. And I can't wait till we actually share it out so you can watch the replay. I'm trying to write notes over here, but I'm like, I have to go back and listen to it, so everyone will get that opportunity. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad you got out of it. Watch it again. Go rest up. I know it's like a ton of information, but I do hope that it's helpful. So take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.